Thomas Hartwell had served as a royal protection officer for 12 years, when his world shifted forever on that gray October morning in 1987. Standing at attention outside the oak-paneled doors of Princess Anne's private study at Gatcombe Park, he maintained his professional composure despite the unusual tension that had gripped the royal household for weeks. The morning had begun like any other. Thomas arrived at dawn, conducted his security sweep of the grounds, and took his position as Princess Anne prepared for what appeared to be another routine day of royal duties. However, the stream of urgent telephone calls, the hushed conversations between staff members, and the princess's increasingly withdrawn demeanor suggested something far more significant was unfolding. Thomas had always prided himself on his discretion. In his years of service, he had witnessed countless private moments, overheard sensitive conversations, and observed the human side of royalty that the public never saw. He understood that his role required absolute loyalty and silence. The royal family trusted their protection officers, not just with their physical safety, but with their secrets, their vulnerabilities, and their most private moments. Princess Anne had always been different from the other royals Thomas had protected. Where others maintained a formal distance, she treated her security team with genuine respect and even warmth. She remembered their names, asked about their families, and showed appreciation for their dedication. Thomas had developed a deep professional respect for her strength, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to her duties. The events leading up to that fateful October morning had been building for months. Thomas had noticed the increasing number of private meetings, the late-night phone calls, and the way Princess Anne's usually confident demeanor had become strained. As her protection officer, he was aware of her schedule, her movements, and the people she met with, but the purpose behind these activities remained hidden from him. On that particular morning, Princess Anne had canceled all her public engagements. This was highly unusual, as she was known for her dedication to her royal duties and rarely altered her schedule without compelling reasons. Thomas had been informed that she would be receiving several important visitors throughout the day, and that maximum security and privacy were required. The first visitor arrived at 9 o'clock sharp. Thomas recognized him as Sir Robert Fellows, the Queen's private secretary, a man whose presence always indicated matters of the utmost importance. He was followed shortly after by Commander Richard Aylard, who served as a senior advisor on royal protocol and security matters. The gravity of their expressions as they passed Thomas suggested this was no ordinary consultation. As the morning progressed, more figures from the royal establishment arrived. Each carried themselves with the weight of serious purpose, their faces reflecting the kind of concern that Thomas had rarely witnessed in his years of service. He maintained his post, ensuring their privacy while remaining alert to any potential security threats. Around midday, Thomas noticed a change in the atmosphere inside the study. The voices, which had been maintaining low, urgent tones throughout the morning, became more animated. He could detect the stress in Princess Anne's voice, though he could not make out the specific words being spoken. As a trained professional, Thomas had developed an acute ability to read situations through subtle cues, changes in vocal tone, body language visible through brief glimpses when doors opened, and the general energy of those around him. The lunch hour came and went without the usual break in activities. Staff members moved through the house with unusual efficiency and purpose, their conversations minimal and their expressions serious. Thomas began to understand that whatever was being discussed in the study would have significant ramifications, not just for Princess Anne, but potentially for the entire royal family. It was during the early afternoon that Thomas first began to piece together fragments of what was happening. A telephone call came through the secure line, and he could hear Princess Anne's voice rising slightly as she spoke. The words, "final decision," "no choice," and "must be done" carried through the heavy wooden door. These phrases, combined with the unusual gathering of senior royal advisors, painted a picture of a crisis that required immediate and decisive action. Thomas had been trained to remain impassive regardless of what he witnessed or overheard, but the growing tension of the day was testing even his professional discipline. He found himself wondering about the nature of the crisis, the options being considered, and the potential consequences of whatever decision Princess Anne was being asked to make. As the afternoon wore on, the meetings became more intense. Thomas could hear the rustle of documents being shuffled, the scratch of pens on paper, and the occasional sound of a chair being moved. The business being conducted was clearly of the highest importance, involving documentation and formal procedures that suggested legal or constitutional implications. Around 4 o'clock, there was a brief lull in activity. Thomas heard the study door open and Sir Robert Fellows emerged, his face pale and drawn. He nodded briefly to Thomas before walking quickly toward the main entrance, his movements suggesting urgency and concern. This departure seemed to signal a shift in the proceedings inside the study. The remaining advisors continued their discussions with Princess Anne, but Thomas noticed that the tone had changed. Where earlier there had been debate and consultation, now there seemed to be a sense of resignation, as if a difficult decision had been reached and the focus had shifted to implementation. It was at this moment that Thomas realized he was about to witness something that would profoundly impact not only Princess Anne's life, but potentially the monarchy itself. The weight of this realization settled on him as he maintained his vigilant watch, understanding that his role as a silent observer was about to become far more significant than he had ever imagined. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows of Gatcombe Park as Thomas continued his duty, unaware that within the next few hours he would overhear words that would change his understanding of loyalty, duty, and the true cost of royal service. The final order that Princess Anne was about to give would test everything Thomas believed about his role as a protector and his obligations as a man of conscience. As the day drew toward evening, Thomas steeled himself for whatever was to come, knowing that some moments in life divide time into before and after. He was about to experience one of those moments, and neither he nor Princess Anne would ever be quite the same again. The shadows grew longer, the house grew quieter, and Thomas waited at his post, faithful in his duty, unaware that he was about to become witness to a moment that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The final preparations were being made inside the study, and soon, very soon, Princess Anne would speak the words that would change everything. The clock in the hallway chimed 6 times as Thomas adjusted his position outside the study door. The autumn evening was settling over Gatcombe Park, and the usual sounds of the household winding down were notably absent. Instead, an almost oppressive quiet had descended over the house, broken only by the muffled voices still emanating from behind the oak doors. Thomas had been standing at his post for nearly 9 hours, a testament to both his physical endurance and professional dedication. However, the mental strain of the day was beginning to take its toll. The constant awareness that something momentous was occurring, combined with his inability to fully understand the situation, created a tension that was almost unbearable. Inside the study, Princess Anne's voice had taken on a quality that Thomas had never heard before. Gone was the confident, authoritative tone he had grown accustomed to over the years. Instead, there was a weariness, a resignation that spoke of someone who had been pushed beyond their limits and forced to make an impossible choice. The remaining advisors in the room, Thomas could identify at least 3 distinct voices, spoke in hushed, urgent tones. Their words were carefully chosen, their sentences measured and deliberate. This was the language of crisis management, of damage control, of people trying to navigate a situation that had no good outcomes. As Thomas listened, he began to discern a pattern in the conversations. There were frequent references to protocol, precedent, and constitutional implications. These were not the typical concerns of daily royal business, but rather the language of fundamental change, of decisions that would reshape the very nature of royal service. Around 6:30, Thomas heard the unmistakable sound of a secure telephone ringing inside the study. Princess Anne's voice became more animated as she answered, and though Thomas could not make out the specific words, he could detect a note of finality in her responses. The conversation was brief but intense, lasting no more than 5 minutes, but its impact was immediate and profound. When the call ended, there was a long period of silence. Thomas found himself straining to hear any sound from within the room, but for several minutes, there was nothing. The quiet was so complete that he began to wonder if the occupants had somehow left the room without his knowledge, though he knew this was impossible given the security arrangements. Finally, Princess Anne's voice broke the silence. Her words were clear and deliberate, spoken with the authority of someone who had wrestled with a terrible decision and finally reached a conclusion. Though Thomas could not yet make out the specific content, the tone conveyed both determination and profound sadness. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Thomas had witnessed in his years of service. The usual formal language of royal business was replaced by something more personal, more human. Princess Anne was not speaking as a member of the royal family bound by protocol and tradition, but as a woman forced to confront the limits of what she could endure. One of the advisors, Thomas, believed it was Commander Overheard, based on the voice, spoke at length about alternatives and other options. His tone was pleading, suggesting that he was trying to convince Princess Anne to reconsider whatever decision she had reached. The response was swift and firm, leaving no room for further discussion. As the evening progressed, Thomas became aware that documents were being prepared. He could hear the rustle of papers, the sound of pens scratching across legal documents, and the occasional request for clarification on specific points. Whatever was being finalized required careful attention to detail and proper legal procedures. Around 7 o'clock, there was another interruption as a new visitor arrived. Thomas recognized the footsteps and bearing of James Morrison, a senior legal advisor who specialized in constitutional law. His presence confirmed Thomas's growing suspicion that the events unfolding were of national significance, involving legal and constitutional questions that went far beyond normal royal business. Morrison's arrival seemed to inject new energy into the proceedings. His voice, when Thomas could catch fragments of it, was professional but urgent. He spoke of implications, ramifications, and precedents, clearly outlining the potential consequences of whatever action Princess Anne was contemplating. Despite Morrison's evident expertise and careful analysis, Princess Anne's resolve appeared unshaken. Her responses were brief but decisive, indicating that she had already considered all the factors he was raising and had reached a conclusion that she was not willing to alter. Thomas found himself in an increasingly difficult position. His training and professional ethics demanded that he maintain his focus on security concerns while remaining detached from the content of the discussions he was protecting. However, the magnitude of what was clearly unfolding made it impossible to remain completely impartial. He was witnessing a moment of profound historical significance, and the weight of that realization was almost overwhelming. As the 8th hour of his vigil approached, Thomas noticed a change in the rhythm of the conversations inside the study. The lengthy discussions and careful deliberations were giving way to shorter, more practical exchanges. Lists were being compiled, procedures were being outlined, and timelines were being established. The decision phase was clearly over, and the implementation phase had begun. Princess Anne's voice during this period carried a quality of steely determination that Thomas had witnessed before, but never under such circumstances. She was methodically working through the practical aspects of her decision, ensuring that every detail was properly addressed and that all necessary arrangements were in place. The most striking aspect of these preparations was their thoroughness. Nothing was being left to chance. No detail was being overlooked, and no potential complication was being ignored. This was the work of someone who understood that once her decision was implemented, there would be no opportunity for corrections or adjustments. Around 8 o'clock, Thomas heard Princess Anne place another secure telephone call. This conversation was longer than the previous one, lasting nearly 15 minutes, and was conducted in a tone that was both formal and deeply personal. Though he could not make out the specific words, Thomas could sense that she was speaking to someone of great importance, someone who needed to be informed of her decision before it was finalized. The call ended with what sounded like expressions of mutual respect and understanding. There were no arguments, no attempts at persuasion, just the acknowledgement between two people who understood the gravity of the situation and the necessity of the decision that had been made. Following this call, there was another period of intense document preparation. Thomas could hear the sound of official seals being applied, signatures being witnessed, and copies being made. The legal formalities were being completed with meticulous attention to proper procedure, ensuring that everything would stand up to the scrutiny that would inevitably follow. As the evening deepened and the 9th hour of Thomas's watch began, he sensed that the climax of the day's events was approaching. The conversations inside the study had taken on a sense of finality, and there was an almost ceremonial quality to the proceedings. Princess Anne was preparing to speak words that would change everything, and Thomas, faithful to his post, would be the only witness to this moment that would reshape his understanding of duty, loyalty, and the true cost of royal service. The weight of what was about to occur settled over Gatcombe Park like a heavy blanket, and Thomas prepared himself to hear words that would echo in his memory for the rest of his life. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 9, as Thomas felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere around him. The conversations behind the oak doors had taken on a different quality, more ritualistic and formal than the urgent consultations that had dominated the day. He could sense that the moment he had been unconsciously preparing for was finally at hand. Princess Anne's voice cut through the evening quiet with unusual clarity. For the first time all day, Thomas could make out complete sentences, and what he heard made his blood run cold. She was speaking about arrangements that went far beyond normal royal protocol, discussing contingencies that suggested she was preparing for something permanent and irreversible. The words that reached Thomas's ears spoke of final arrangements, succession protocols, and transfer of responsibilities. These were not the concerns of someone planning a temporary absence or a routine change in duties. Princess Anne was speaking like someone who was preparing to step away from her role entirely, and the gravity of this realization struck Thomas with the force of a physical blow. Commander Ailard's voice rose in what sounded like a final attempt at persuasion. Thomas could hear him outlining alternatives, suggesting compromises, and painting scenarios that might allow Princess Anne to continue her royal duties while addressing whatever crisis had brought them to this point. His tone was earnest and desperate, that of a man who understood the catastrophic implications of what was about to occur. Princess Anne's response was measured, but absolute. She spoke of having no choice, of situations that had become impossible to sustain, and of decisions that, while painful, were necessary for the greater good. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had wrestled with every possible alternative and found them all wanting. Thomas had never heard Princess Anne speak with such raw emotion while maintaining her composure. There was pain in her voice, certainly, but also a kind of liberation, as if she was finally free to act according to her conscience rather than the constraints of her position. It was the voice of someone who had chosen personal integrity over institutional loyalty, regardless of the cost. The legal advisor Morrison spoke next, his words careful and precise. He outlined the procedures that would need to be followed, the notifications that would need to be made, and the timeline for implementation. His tone was professional but tinged with sadness, suggesting that even he, despite his legal training and institutional perspective, understood the human cost of what was being finalized. As Thomas listened to these procedural discussions, he began to piece together the broader picture of what was happening. Princess Anne was not simply stepping back from certain duties or taking a leave of absence. She was making a decision that would fundamentally alter her relationship with the royal family and her role within the constitutional framework of the monarchy. The implications were staggering. Princess Anne had always been regarded as one of the most dedicated and effective members of the royal family. Her work ethic was legendary. Her commitment to her various patronages was unwavering, and her support for the Queen had been absolute. For someone of her stature and dedication to reach such a drastic decision suggested that the circumstances driving this choice were truly extraordinary. Around 9:30, Thomas heard the sound of chairs being moved and papers being gathered. The formal business of the evening appeared to be drawing to a close, but Princess Anne was not finished. She asked for a few moments alone to compose what she referred to as her final statement. The advisors filed out of the room, leaving her in the solitude she required for this crucial task. Thomas found himself alone in the hallway with Princess Anne just a few feet away behind the closed door. The weight of the moment was almost unbearable. He could hear the scratch of her pen as she wrote, the occasional pause as she searched for the right words, and the soft sound of papers being turned. She was crafting the words that would explain her decision to the world, and Thomas was the silent witness to this historic moment. After what seemed like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, Princess Anne called for her advisors to return. When they had reassembled, she began to read aloud what she had written. Her voice was steady and clear, but Thomas could detect the emotion underlying her composed delivery. The statement began with an expression of gratitude for the privilege of royal service and a declaration of continuing loyalty to the crown and the country. Princess Anne spoke of the honor she had felt in representing the monarchy and the deep satisfaction she had derived from her various charitable and official duties. However, she continued, Circumstances had arisen that made it impossible for her to continue in her current role while maintaining her personal integrity and effectiveness. She spoke of conflicts between her personal convictions and the demands of her position, of situations where she could no longer reconcile what was expected of her with what she believed to be right. Thomas listened with growing amazement as Princess Anne articulated her position with remarkable clarity and dignity. She was not leaving in anger or frustration, but rather making a principled decision based on irreconcilable differences between her role and her conscience. She spoke of the difficulty of this choice and her deep regret at the necessity of making it. The most striking aspect of her statement was its tone of finality. Princess Anne was not asking for understanding or seeking to justify her decision to others. She was simply explaining her position with the dignity and directness that had always characterized her approach to difficult situations. She understood the consequences of her choice and was prepared to accept them. As she concluded her statement, Princess Anne addressed the question of succession and continuity. She outlined the arrangements she had made to ensure that her various patronages and responsibilities would be properly transferred to other members of the royal family. Her concern for the institutions and causes she was leaving behind was evident, and she had clearly invested considerable thought in ensuring their continued effectiveness. The advisors received her statement in respectful silence. There were no further attempts at persuasion, no last-minute appeals for reconsideration. They understood that Princess Anne had reached this decision after careful thought, and that further discussion would be both futile and inappropriate. Morrison spoke briefly about the procedures for making the statement public and the timeline for its implementation. He outlined the various notifications that would need to be made and the protocols that would govern the announcement. His tone was matter-of-fact, but Thomas could detect an underlying sadness at the necessity of these arrangements. Commander Aylard made one final comment about the impact of Princess Anne's decision on the royal family and the monarchy as a whole. He spoke respectfully but candidly about the challenges her departure would create and the difficulty of replacing someone of her experience and dedication. His words carried no criticism, only acknowledgement of a loss that would be deeply felt. Princess Anne responded with grace and appreciation for his concerns. She expressed her confidence in the ability of the remaining members of the royal family to continue the work she was leaving behind, and she spoke of her hope that her decision, while difficult, would ultimately serve the best interests of the monarchy she had served faithfully for so many years. As the formal proceedings drew to a close, Thomas realized that he had witnessed something unprecedented in modern royal history. Princess Anne's decision represented a watershed moment, a demonstration that even the most dedicated royal servants had limits, and that personal integrity sometimes required the ultimate sacrifice of position and privilege. The evening was far from over, however. The most dramatic moment still lay ahead, and Thomas, faithful to his duty, would soon hear the words that would change his life forever. The clock struck 10 as the advisors prepared to leave Gatcombe Park. Thomas watched through the hallway window as their official cars were brought around, their headlights cutting through the October darkness. The formal business of the evening had been concluded, the documents had been signed and sealed, and the procedures for implementation had been established. Yet something in Princess Anne's demeanor suggested that the most significant moment was still to come. After the last advisor had departed, Princess Anne remained in her study for several more minutes. Thomas could hear her moving about the room, the sound of filing cabinets being opened and closed, and the rustle of papers being organized. She was conducting what sounded like a final review of her personal effects and official documents, preparing for a transition that would mark the end of one chapter of her life and the beginning of another. When Princess Anne finally emerged from the study, Thomas was struck by the change in her appearance. Gone was the tension that had marked her features throughout the day. In its place was a kind of serene determination, the look of someone who had made a difficult decision and found peace in its completion. She looked directly at Thomas, and for a moment he thought she might speak to him directly about the events of the day. Instead, she simply nodded in acknowledgement of his long vigil and asked if he would accompany her on a final walk through the house. This request was unusual but not unprecedented, and Thomas immediately fell into step behind her as she began what would prove to be a journey through memories and a final accounting of her royal life. Princess Anne's walk through Gatcombe Park was deliberate and methodical. She paused in each room, her gaze taking in details that she had perhaps taken for granted during her years of residence. In the main drawing room, she stood for several minutes before the portrait of the Queen, her expression thoughtful and respectful. Thomas could sense that she was conducting a silent dialogue with the institution she was preparing to leave behind. In her private office, Princess Anne gathered several personal items, photographs, letters, and small mementos that held particular significance. She handled each object with care, as if committing its importance to memory one final time. Thomas watched this process with growing understanding that he was witnessing the dissolution of a life dedicated to royal service. The most poignant moment came when Princess Anne paused before a display case containing medals, honors, and awards she had received over her years of royal duty. She stood in silence for nearly 10 minutes, and Thomas could see her shoulders trembling slightly with suppressed emotion. These tangible symbols of her service represented decades of dedication, sacrifice, and achievement that she was now preparing to set aside. When Princess Anne finally spoke, her words were addressed not to Thomas directly, but rather to the house itself, as if she were saying goodbye to a trusted companion. She spoke of the years of happiness and service that Gatcombe Park had witnessed, of the important work that had been conducted within its walls, and of her gratitude for the privilege of calling it home. As they continued their tour, Princess Anne began to share memories and reflections that revealed the depth of her connection to her royal role. She spoke of visits from foreign dignitaries, of charity events that had raised significant funds for important causes, and of the countless individuals whose lives had been touched by her work. These recollections were tinged with both pride and sadness, the natural emotions of someone saying farewell to a life's work. In the library, Princess Anne pulled several books from the shelves, volumes on constitutional law, royal history, and protocol that had guided her throughout her career. She spoke briefly about the education these texts had provided and the principles they had instilled in her understanding of royal duty. Her tone suggested that these principles, while respected, were no longer sufficient to guide her actions in the changed circumstances she faced. It was in the conservatory, overlooking the gardens that had been her particular pride, that Princess Anne finally addressed Thomas directly. She thanked him for his years of dedicated service, acknowledging the personal sacrifices that royal protection officers made in the course of their duties. She spoke of the trust that existed between the royal family and their security personnel, and of her appreciation for the discretion and professionalism that had characterized his service. Thomas found himself deeply moved by Princess Anne's words of appreciation. Throughout his career, he had served with the understanding that his efforts would largely go unrecognized, that his success would be measured by the absence of incidents rather than by public acknowledgement. To receive such personal and heartfelt recognition from Princess Anne was both unexpected and profoundly meaningful. As they stood in the conservatory, Princess Anne began to speak about the challenges that had led to her decision. She spoke carefully, aware that Thomas was bound by the same oath of discretion that had governed his service. But she seemed to feel a need to explain, at least in general terms, the forces that had compelled her to take such drastic action. She spoke of conflicts between personal conviction and institutional expectation, of situations where the demands of royal protocol had come into direct opposition with her sense of right and wrong. She described the gradual erosion of her ability to serve effectively as these conflicts had intensified, and the growing realization that continuing in her role would compromise both her integrity and her effectiveness. Princess Anne's explanation was measured and thoughtful, avoiding specific details while conveying the general nature of her dilemma. Thomas listened with growing respect for the princess's courage in choosing personal integrity over institutional loyalty, even at such enormous personal cost. Her decision represented the kind of moral courage that he had always admired, but rarely had the opportunity to witness firsthand. As their conversation continued, Princess Anne began to speak about the future. She expressed confidence in the monarchy's ability to adapt and continue its important work even in her absence. She spoke of her faith in the remaining members of the royal family and their commitment to the principles of service that had always defined the institution. Most significantly, Princess Anne addressed the question of her own future. While she could not continue as a working member of the royal family, she spoke of her intention to find other ways to serve the country and the causes that had always been important to her. Her decision to step away from royal duty was not a retreat from public service, but rather a transition to a different form of contribution to society. Around 11 o'clock, as their walk through the house neared completion, Princess Anne led Thomas back to her study. The room had been transformed during their absence, cleared of the formal documents and official paraphernalia that had marked the day's proceedings. In its place was a simple, personal workspace that reflected Princess Anne's preparation for her new life. It was here, in the familiar surroundings of her private study, that Princess Anne prepared to give the order that would change everything. She sat down at her desk, picked up the secure telephone, and placed a call that Thomas immediately recognized as being of the utmost importance. Her words, when they came, would transform not only her own life, but also Thomas's understanding of duty, loyalty, and the true meaning of royal service. The moment that had been building throughout the long day was finally at hand, and Thomas, faithful to his post, prepared to hear words that would echo in his memory for the rest of his life. The secure telephone rang once before being answered. Princess Anne's voice, when she began to speak, carried an authority that Thomas had never heard before. Not the authority of royal position, but the deeper authority of absolute personal conviction. The words that followed would forever change Thomas's understanding of what it meant to serve with true honor. "Your Majesty," Princess Anne began, her voice steady and clear, "I am calling to formally notify you of my irrevocable decision to renounce my position within the working royal family, effective immediately. After extensive consideration and consultation with constitutional advisors." The pause that followed was profound. Thomas could feel the weight of centuries of royal tradition and constitutional precedent hanging in the air. Princess Anne was not simply resigning from a job. She was voluntarily severing herself from an institution that had defined British society for over 1,000 years. When she continued, Princess Anne's words were measured and deliberate, each sentence carefully constructed to convey both respect for the monarchy and firmness in her resolve. "The circumstances that have led to this decision are such that any attempt to continue my current role would compromise both the effectiveness of the crown and my ability to serve with the dedication that the British people deserve." Thomas listened with growing amazement as Princess Anne outlined the practical arrangements she had made for her departure. She had personally contacted each of her major patronages to ensure smooth transitions, had coordinated with other members of the royal family to redistribute her official duties, and had worked with constitutional experts to ensure that her withdrawal would create minimal disruption to the monarchy's operations. The thoroughness of her preparations spoke to Princess Anne's fundamental character. Even in the act of leaving the royal family, she was determined to fulfill her responsibilities and protect the institution she could no longer serve. Her final act of royal duty was ensuring that her departure would strengthen rather than weaken the crown. "I want to emphasize," Princess Anne continued, her voice carrying deep emotion despite her controlled delivery, "that this decision reflects no criticism of the monarchy itself or of Your Majesty's leadership. Rather, it represents my recognition that personal circumstances have created an irreconcilable conflict between my individual conscience and my institutional obligations." The conversation that followed was largely one-sided, with Princess Anne providing detailed responses to questions that Thomas could not hear but could infer from her answers. She spoke of legal precedents, constitutional implications, and practical considerations with the expertise of someone who had spent months researching every aspect of her unprecedented decision. Most remarkably, Princess Anne addressed the question of her future relationship with the royal family. Despite her decision to withdraw from official duties, she expressed her desire to maintain personal relationships with her family members and her continued respect for the institution of the monarchy. Her withdrawal was professional, not personal, motivated by principle rather than animosity. "I will, of course, continue to be bound by the oath of confidentiality I swore upon beginning my royal service," Princess Anne stated firmly. "My decision to step away from active duty in no way diminishes my commitment to protecting the dignity and privacy of the crown. My silence on internal matters will remain absolute." As the conversation neared its conclusion, Princess Anne's voice took on a more personal tone. She spoke of her gratitude for the opportunities she had been given, the meaningful work she had been able to accomplish, and the personal growth she had experienced through her years of royal service. Her words conveyed genuine appreciation rather than mere diplomatic courtesy. The final exchange was brief but deeply moving. Princess Anne expressed her love and continued loyalty to the Queen personally, while maintaining her firm commitment to her decision professionally. The conversation ended with mutual expressions of respect and understanding, despite the fundamental disagreement about the necessity of Princess Anne's withdrawal. After ending the call, Princess Anne sat quietly for several minutes, the weight of what she had just accomplished evident in her posture and expression. She had just voluntarily given up one of the most privileged positions in British society, choosing personal integrity over institutional loyalty in a decision that would have far-reaching consequences for both herself and the monarchy. When Princess Anne finally rose from her desk, she turned to face Thomas directly for the first time that evening. Her expression was a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and determination. She had completed the most difficult task of her life, and while the future held uncertainty and challenges, she had acted according to her deepest convictions. "Thomas," she said quietly, using his name for the first time in their long professional relationship, "I want you to know that what you have witnessed today will remain between us forever. Not because I am ashamed of my decision, but because the full circumstances cannot be shared without compromising the very institution I still seek to protect." Thomas nodded his understanding, recognizing that he had been entrusted with knowledge that went far beyond his official duties as a protection officer. Princess Anne was asking for his personal discretion as well as his professional silence, and he understood the gravity of that trust. Princess Anne then gave Thomas what would indeed be her final order as a member of the working royal family. "Please ensure that all security protocols for my official status are terminated as of midnight tonight. Contact your superiors and inform them that I will no longer require royal protection services. My status has changed permanently, and the arrangements must reflect that reality." The finality of this instruction hit Thomas like a physical blow. Princess Anne was not just stepping away from her duties, she was completely severing her connection to the official apparatus of royalty. She was choosing to face an uncertain future without the protection and support that had surrounded her for her entire adult life. As Thomas prepared to carry out this final order, Princess Anne offered one last observation that would stay with him forever. "True service," she said quietly, "sometimes requires the ultimate sacrifice of the position that enables that service. I hope that someday you will understand that what I have done today was not abandonment of duty, but its highest expression." With those words, Princess Anne retired to her private quarters, leaving Thomas alone in the study to contemplate the extraordinary events he had witnessed. He understood that he had been present at a moment of profound historical significance, a demonstration of individual courage that transcended the usual boundaries of royal service. As Thomas prepared to make the phone calls that would terminate Princess Anne's official status, he reflected on the lessons he had learned about loyalty, duty, and personal integrity. Princess Anne had shown him that true service sometimes required the courage to stand alone, that personal conviction could be more important than institutional loyalty, and that the highest form of duty might involve sacrificing the very position that enabled that service. The guard who had begun the day as a simple protector ended it as a witness to history. Thomas carried out Princess Anne's final order with the same professionalism that had marked his entire career, but he did so with a transformed understanding of what it meant to serve with honor. The moment that had changed everything was now complete, and its implications would resonate far beyond the walls of Gatcombe Park into the very heart of the monarchy itself. Years later, Thomas would reflect on that October evening as the moment when he learned the true meaning of courage. Princess Anne had taught him that real bravery was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what was right despite the cost. It was a lesson that would guide him for the rest of his life, a final gift from a princess who had chosen principle over privilege and integrity over institutional loyalty. The guard who overheard Princess Anne's final order had indeed witnessed a moment that changed everything, not just for the monarchy, but for his own understanding of what it truly meant to serve with honor, conviction, and unwavering courage in the face of impossible choices.